In 1961, a 7-year-old boy came home from school to find his father lying on the couch. His ankle was broken. He had no job, no insurance, no sick pay, and no plan. The system had discarded him completely. That boy stood in the doorway of a Brooklyn housing project and watched his father become a smaller man. He never forgot it. 60 years later, that boy was worth $4 billion. But the couch never left him. This is the psychology of Howard Schultz, and what happens when a wound becomes the engine of everything you build. Howard Schultz was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. His family lived in the Bayview housing projects in Canarsie, a federal housing complex built for families with nowhere else to go. His father, Fred Schultz, worked a series of blue-collar jobs his entire life: truck driver, factory worker, cab driver. Fred was not a bad man. He was a man who worked hard inside a system that had no interest in protecting him. No benefits, no union, no safety net. When Fred broke his ankle driving a truck in 1961, he was fired the same week. No compensation, no support, nothing. Howard watched his father come home and not leave the couch for months. He watched the shame settle into his father's body like something permanent. He watched his mother's face when she thought no one was looking, and he felt something form inside him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to resolve. Psychologists who study childhood shame experiences describe a specific phenomenon. When a child witnesses a parent being humiliated by forces outside the family, it does something particular to the child's developing sense of the world. It is not the same as being humiliated yourself. It is in some ways worse because you cannot even fight back. You can only watch. And watching helplessly while someone you love is diminished by a system too large to challenge. That experience tends to produce one of two responses in the adult the child becomes: resignation or obsession. Fred Schultz resigned. Howard Schultz became obsessed. Schultz was a gifted athlete growing up: football, baseball, basketball. Sport was the first place. He found that effort had a direct and visible relationship to outcome. Unlike his father's world, where working hard meant nothing if the system decided to discard you, in sport the connection between input and result was clean and legible. He earned a football scholarship to Northern Michigan University, the first person in his family to attend college. That fact alone deserves a moment. He was not just leaving the housing project. He was crossing a line that no one in his family had ever crossed. And crossing that line alone, without a map, is psychologically disorienting in a way that people who grew up with college as an assumption simply cannot understand. There is a concept in psychology called first-generation college student syndrome, not a clinical diagnosis, but a recognized pattern. Students who are the first in their family to attend university frequently experience profound imposter syndrome, social anxiety, and a guilt about advancement that children of educated parents almost never feel. The guilt is specific. It is the guilt of moving towards something your parents could not reach, of becoming, in some sense, someone they are not. Schultz has spoken about this period with honesty, the discomfort of not quite fitting anywhere, of being from a world that college did not prepare you for, and moving toward a world that did not yet fully accept you. He graduated, he moved to New York, he built a career in sales, and he carried the housing project with him every step of the way, not as shame, but as fuel. In 1981, Schultz was working for a housewares company when he noticed that a small Seattle coffee retailer called Starbucks was ordering an unusual number of a particular type of coffee maker. He flew to Seattle to see why. He walked into the original Starbucks store, a small, serious place that sold whole coffee beans and equipment, and felt something he had not felt since sport: a direct, visible connection between quality and outcome. He joined the company in 1982 as director of marketing. 1 year later, he traveled to Milan for a housewares trade show and walked into an Italian espresso bar. He stood there for a long time. The barista knew the customers by name. The customers lingered. The coffee was not a product. It was a ritual, a relationship, a reason to be somewhere. Schultz flew home with an idea that would consume the next decade of his life. He proposed to the Starbucks founders that they transform from a coffee bean retailer into an espresso bar chain. They said no. He left, raised his own funding, and opened his own espresso bar chain called Il Giornale in 1985. In 1987, he bought Starbucks itself with investor backing for $3.8 million and merged the two companies. He kept the Starbucks name. He was 34 years old. Here is where most versions of this story end. Entrepreneur has vision. Entrepreneur faces rejection. Entrepreneur persists. Entrepreneur wins. But the psychological story, the real one, is just beginning at this point. Because everything Schultz built next was not just a business. It was a direct, conscious, psychologically precise response to what he had watched happen to his father on that couch in 1961. In 1988, 1 year after taking over Starbucks, Schultz introduced full health insurance benefits for part-time employees working 20 hours or more per week. This was almost unheard of in the American service industry at the time. His board of directors thought he had lost his mind. Part-time workers in retail and food service did not receive health insurance. That was simply how the industry worked. Schultz did not present this as a moral argument. He presented it as a business decision. That employees who felt protected would be more loyal, more engaged, more invested. He was right, and the data eventually proved it. But the data was not why he did it. He did it because of his father's ankle. He did it because of the couch. He did it because he had watched the specific, particular damage that an unprotected system does to a working man's dignity. And he had never, at any point in his adult life, stopped being the 7-year-old boy standing in that doorway. This is a psychological phenomenon researchers call a formative wound, driving prosocial behavior. It describes what happens when early experiences of witnessed injustice become the motivational engine for systemic change in the adult. It is different from personal ambition. Personal ambition says, I want more for myself. A formative wound says, I cannot rest until the thing that hurt someone I loved stops hurting people like them. The distinction matters because it explains a quality of persistence that ordinary ambition does not produce. Schultz did not give Starbucks employees health insurance because it was good PR. He gave it to them because not giving it would have required him to become the system that broke his father. And that was the one thing he was constitutionally incapable of doing. But here is the part of the story that the Harvard Business School case studies leave out. The same psychological engine that drove Schultz to build something extraordinary also made it nearly impossible for him to let it go. Schultz stepped down as Starbucks CEO in 2000. The company began to drift, rapid expansion, declining quality, loss of the intimacy he had built the brand around. By 2008, the stock had fallen nearly 90% from its peak. Schultz came back. He took the CEO role again, closed 600 underperforming stores, laid off thousands of employees, and rebuilt the company from the center outward. He stepped down again in 2017. By 2022, he was back a third time, called in again when the company began to struggle. 3 returns, 3 abandonments of retirement, 3 moments when Howard Schultz, a man who had every reason to rest, found he could not. And the question worth asking, the psychological question, is not why he kept coming back. The question is what it tells us about the relationship between a wound and the structure a person builds to address it. When your deepest motivation is not what you want but what you need to fix, the fixing never quite finishes. Because the wound is not actually in the company. The wound is in a 7-year-old boy standing in a doorway watching his father disappear. No number of healthcare policies will reach that boy. No stock price will reassure him. No successful turnaround will finally convince him that the system can be made safe. Because he saw, before he had words for it, that it cannot always be made safe. And so he keeps building and fixing and returning. Because stopping would mean accepting what his father had to accept. And that is the one thing he has never been able to do. There is something important to sit with here. Something that applies beyond Howard Schultz, beyond Starbucks, beyond any single story. We tend to talk about childhood trauma as something that needs to be healed before a person can succeed. As if the wound is the obstacle and the healing is the prerequisite. Schultz's story, like Gardner's, like Stallone's, suggests something more complicated. The wound was not the obstacle. The wound was the engine. Not despite the pain of watching his father, because of it. But there is a cost to running on a wound that running on ordinary ambition does not carry. Ordinary ambition has a finish line, a point at which the goal is achieved and the motivation can rest. A wound does not have a finish line, because the wound is not asking for achievement. It is asking for repair. And some things, the specific, irreversible, already happened things, cannot be repaired. They can only be responded to. Schultz responded for 60 years. He built a company with 400,000 employees. He gave health insurance to people whose employers had never considered giving it. He created a version of the workplace that his father never had access to. He could not go back and fix 1961, but he could make 1988 different, and 1995, and 2008, and every year between. The question this story is really asking is one that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What are you actually building, and who are you building it for? Not in the abstract sense of legacy or impact. In the specific, honest, uncomfortable sense. Is there someone you watched be diminished? A parent, a sibling, a version of yourself at an age when you had no power. Is there something you are trying to build that would, if it existed then, have changed what happened? Most people who are driven, genuinely, relentlessly, inexplicably driven, are not driven by what they want. They are driven by what they witnessed. The ambition is real, but underneath the ambition is a picture, a specific, private, never fully articulated picture of a moment that should have gone differently. And everything they build is, in some sense, an attempt to make it go differently in the lives of other people. That is not a weakness. That is the most human thing there is. It just comes with a cost that success alone will never cancel. The cost is that you never fully arrive, because arriving would mean letting go of the doorway. And the doorway is where you first understood what mattered. Fred Schultz never knew what his broken ankle built. He died before Starbucks became what it became. He never saw the health insurance policies. He never saw the 400,000 employees who had what he didn't. Howard Schultz has spoken about his father with a grief that success never touched. The money couldn't reach it. The company couldn't reach it. The only thing that could reach it was the work itself. The daily, ongoing, never-finished work of building something his father deserved to work inside. That is what drives the people who cannot stop. Not hunger, not ego, not ambition. Love for someone who needed protecting in a moment that has already passed, in a world that is still worth trying to fix. Every week on this channel we take a real human story and break it down using psychology to find the pattern underneath. Why people self-sabotage, why smart people stay stuck, why some people break through and others don't. If that is the kind of thing you want to understand about yourself, about the people around you, subscribe to Human Code and hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. We post every single day. The next story is already waiting for you.